Hi, I'm Roy from Roy's Garage. Today I'm going to be working on a 1999 Toyota Camry 2.2 liter 4-cylinder. I'm going to show you how to replace the timing belt, water pump, some cam and crank seals, oil pump shaft seal, oil pump shaft O-ring, external belts, thermostat, and upper and lower radiator hose. These are the tools I'm going to be using today to do this job. Pry bar, hood prop, half-inch pipe I use to extend my 3/8 ratchet, half-inch impact, half-inch ratchet, 36mm socket I use to install my cam seal, 19mm socket, 3/8 impact, 3/8 ratchet, another 3/8 ratchet, 3/8 extension, two different lengths, 14mm socket, two different length 12mm socket, 10mm socket, 1/4-inch ratchet, quarter-inch, another quarter-inch ratchet, quarter-inch extension, another quarter-inch extension, three different length 10mm sockets. This is a 10mm swivel socket. This is a 8mm socket, cotter pin puller, a pick, air gun, contact cement, brake clean, silicone spray, anti-seize, white grease, silicone lubricant, black tape, rubber mallet, 3-pound sledgehammer, ball peen hammer, brass punch, another punch, two different length screwdrivers, 14mm wrench, 10mm wrench, another 14mm wrench, crescent wrench, a vice grip, harmonic balancer puller, dielectric grease, silicone, flush gun, clip, my airlift tool to vacuum out the cooling system. These are the parts I'm going to be using today to do this job. Upper hose, lower hose, power steering pump belt, AC alternator belt, timing belt, oil pump O-ring, crank seal, timing belt tensioner spring, oil pump shaft seal, cam seal, thermostat, thermostat seal, timing belt tensioner, the lower timing belt pulley, thermostat housing, and antifreeze. Okay, so first I jacked up the vehicle and I removed the passenger front, right front tire. So I'm going to be opening up my drain plug. I'm going to be draining out the coolant. Opening up the radiator cap. Okay. So first, we're going to be removing this upper strut mount. Let's disconnect this ground wire. Okay, I'm going to be removing the alternator. You should disconnect the battery before you remove the main wire to the alternator. But I'm going to be removing this main wire. Just got to be really careful not to touch this wire to any metal part of the engine, or else you're going to short it out. If you don't feel comfortable doing this, just disconnect the battery. So I'm going to get some black electrical tape, tape up this end. Don't want this guy touching any metal object. removing this connector. Just push this clip down and pull out the connector. This guy's so brittle, it's all broken. Removing this mount. Okay. So removing the alternator. So removing the alternator mount and the strut mount. I'm going to be removing this coolant recovery tank to get a little bit more room. Okay, so I'm going to be removing this upper strut mount that bolts to the engine. There's 2 bolts under there. Remove it. Unplugging the crank sensor wire. Removing this alternator bracket. Okay, so now I'm on the passenger side front. I'm going to be removing this plastic shield. Okay, so I'm going to be removing the power steering belt. There's an adjustment right there. We got to slack it. Loosen that guy up. Pull this belt. Take the belt off. Removing the alternator AC belt. Removing my crankshaft pulley. Okay. Sometimes this pulley will just slide off, but in this case it's stuck on the crank. So I'm going to be using a puller to pull this pulley. Removing the upper half of the timing belt cover. Underneath the car, removing the lower half of the timing belt cover. Okay, removing this metal piece, the one that holds the belt in. So I'm going to be turning the crankshaft until we get top dead center, screwing in my bolt, and I'm going to be turning the crankshaft. So we're going to be lining up this hole with this slot. This is on the cam gear. Okay, so before we remove this belt, I'm going to be marking where the belt and the cam gear meets, and I'm going to go underneath where the belt and the crank gear meets. So always mark it before you take it off. So this guy, the mark would be probably around here. So I'm going to be turning the crank until this comes around, right around here, so it's easier to mark. So I'm going to be marking my belt and marking the cam gear. I usually like to mark this as a T, like the top. Okay. Now we're going to go underneath and mark the belt and the crank gear. Okay, removing the crank bolt. So marking the timing belt and the crank gear. So before we remove the belt, I'm going to be loosening up this oil pump gear. Okay, loosening up the oil pump gear. Just loosen it up, don't take it all the way off. Loosening up this cam bolt while the belt is still on. Loosening up the timing belt tensioner. Okay, so with my pry bar, I'm going to pry this tensioner down. Tightening it up. Removing the belt. Removing the cam gear. Removing the tensioner. Removing the idler pulley. Okay, so I'm gonna be removing this water pump, removing this radiator hose, removing the water outlet, and removing the pump. We're gonna have to remove this pipes. There's two bolts we gotta remove. So removing the water pump bolts. Okay, removing the crank gear. Just pull it out. So I'm going to be removing this oil pump. Cleaning up the engine block with some brake clean. There's a lot of oil in here. Removing the old O-ring. I'm using my pick, just dig it out. Okay, so I'm going to be using some spray adhesive. And I'm going to stick it onto the block side. Putting on the oil pump gear. Cleaning up my oil pump. Okay, we're going to be removing the shaft. Removing the old oil pump seal. Installing the new seal using some white grease. Putting some grease on my shaft. Putting on my pulley. Putting on the nut. Okay, so now we're going to install the pump. Putting on my oil pump. Putting some anti-seize on my bolts. So I'm going to replace the cam seal. Just got to dig it out with a screwdriver or a cotter pin puller, whatever you got. Just got to dig it out. Greasing up my seal with some white grease. So with a socket, I gotta try push it in. Make sure that lip is in. Okay, so I'm gonna be digging out the old crank seal. Lubricating my crank seal. So I'm just gonna tap it in with my punch. Just be careful. So we're gonna be flushing out the block side cooling system. Removing this upper hose. So I'm gonna be pumping water and air through the top hose. So I'm gonna flush out the radiator. We're gonna back flush this thing from the bottom to the top. So I removed the top hose and now I connect it to the top of the radiator and I directed it away from us. Now I'm going to be pumping water and air through the lower radiator hose. Just got to be careful, don't push this trigger too fast. So we're going to be installing the water pump. Put these O-rings on. This is what came with the water pump. Okay, so we're going to be putting on the gasket. And then this O-ring that came with the pump goes onto the engine side. So I took the old O-ring off this pipe. So now I'm going to be putting the new one on. So I'm going to be putting some silicone grease right around this O-ring. That way when it slides into the pump, it just slips right in. So I'm gonna put some RTV silicone right around this O-ring. Putting some RTV silicone around this gasket. Installing the water pump. Bolting it up. Bolting the tube up to the back of the water pump. Installing the idler pulley. Installing the tensioner. Installing the cam gear. Slap the tensioner. So I'm going to be installing the crank gear. First, put some anti-seize around the crank. Lubricating the inside of my crank gear. Okay, sliding the gear on. Oh, so this is the old timing belt. What we're going to do is transfer this mark and this mark to the new timing belt. I did it already, but how I did it was I put it like this, and then you got to make sure it has to be the exact same position. If you're one teeth off, it might not start. Installing the belt, make sure you line up the marks. So I'm going to get this clamp the belt to the pulley so it doesn't move. Now we're going to go underneath. So we got to line up the marks. So you're going to have to turn either the crank or the cam to line it up. Okay, now the belt is lined up to the crank gear. So I'm going to be releasing the tensioner. Putting on my crank bolt. So now I'm going to be turning the crank clockwise. Okay, so I turned the crank about one turn. That's to tension the belt. Now we're going to tighten up the tensioner, the cam bolt, and the oil pump bolt. Tightening up the oil pump shaft bolt. Removing the crankshaft bolt. Don't forget to put this metal plate. This is what holds the timing belt in. Installing the lower timing belt cover. Putting on the upper timing belt cover. Putting on my harmonic balancer. Put some anti-seize right in here. Slide it on. Putting on my crank bolt. Tightening up the bolt. So I'm gonna be putting on my thermostat, but first I'm gonna be putting my rubber seal around the thermostat. And this is my new thermostat housing. Originally it came out with a plastic housing, but this is an aftermarket housing, so this one just so happens it's an aluminum one. Putting on my thermostat and my thermostat housing. Lubricate the stud with some anti-seize. Make sure this breather hole is facing the top. So I'm gonna be connecting my bottom hose. I'm gonna be reusing the old hose. This guy looks pretty good. Putting on the strut mount bracket. Don't make this bracket tight right now. Just have it a little bit loose. Installing the alternator bracket. Put a little anti-seize on the bolts. Tightening up this bracket. Tighten up this bracket. Okay, installing the upper strut mount. Now tighten everything up. Putting on this alternator bracket. Connecting the ground wire together. Okay, clipping this guy on to the bracket. Putting some dielectric grease right in this connector. Connecting this wire. In this bracket a little more. Running the wire behind this alternator bracket. Putting some dielectric grease in my connector. Installing the alternator. It doesn't want to fit, so there's a sleeve over here. I'm going to have to move the sleeve to open it up. So with a brass punch and a hammer, I'm just going to pound it. Okay. Installing the alternator. So now I can tighten up this lower bracket. So now we can install the external belts. So I'm going to be installing my power steering pump belt first. Tightening up the belt. Putting on the alternator belt. Putting on my wires for the alternator. Putting some dielectric grease. Putting on my hot lead. Gotta be careful because this wire is live. I didn't disconnect the battery. Cleaning up this outlet with some sandpaper. Installing my new upper hose. Shooting some silicone spray in the hose. On the outlet, on the radiator. Some in my hose. That way it slips on a lot easier. Let's put the clamp on. Tightening my clamp. Putting on this plastic shield. Installing my coolant recovery tank. So now I'm going to be adding in my antifreeze. But first I'm going to be vacuuming out the system. I'm going to be using this airlift tool. I'm going to draw a vacuum about 15-16 inches. And then I'm going to put the antifreeze in. It's going to suck the antifreeze in. And it's going to remove all the air pockets. Okay, clamping off my return line. So I'm going to be connecting my air, pulling a vacuum. You notice this hose is collapsing. Okay, so that should be good enough. Open the valve. Now it's going to be sucking in the antifreeze. It's going to go in real fast. Make sure you don't run out of antifreeze. You don't want this guy sucking in any air. Remove my airlift tool. This guy's practically full. Filling up my coolant recovery tank. So I'm going to start up the vehicle. Okay, so now we're going to run this chain through the heat cycle. Let your fan come on maybe about 2 or 3 times. Then road test. So I road tested the vehicle. I let it cool down, topped off the fluid, and good to go. If you have any questions, comment below. Make sure to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and I see you in the next video. Aloha.